Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Haymarket Books Live tonight. My name is Carlos Enriquez, and I'm part of the programming and events team at Haymarket Books. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, conversation, and celebration of the launch of the second edition of the Communist Manifesto, a roadmap to history's most important document. Here it is so you all can see it. I'm honored to welcome our special guests tonight who are with us. With us are Phil Gasper. Phil is the editor of the Communist Manifesto, a roadmap to history's most important political document, and is on the editorial board of New Politics. He is professor emeritus of philosophy at du Notre Dame du Namur University in California, and currently lives in Madison, Wisconsin. We also have Sabrina Fernandes. Sabrina is a Brazilian sociologist and political economist, and the head of research at the Alameda Institute. She holds a PhD from Carleton University and was formerly a postdoctoral fellow in the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and with the Center of Advanced Latin American Studies. She is an eco-socialist activist, a member of the Eco-Social Pact of the South, and her research is focused on transition, Latin America, and internationalism. She's also the editor of the special editions of the Communist Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, published in Portuguese by Paz et Tierra. And we also have Vanessa Wills. Vanessa is associate professor of philosophy at the George Washington University. She's a founding editor of Spectre Journal, biannual journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. Her monograph, Marx's Ethical Vision, is forthcoming in June and available for pre-order from Oxford University Press. So we're going to have Phil kick us off tonight. So whenever you're ready, Phil.
Thanks so much, Carlos, and thanks to Sabrina and Vanessa for joining this conversation. The Communist Manifesto was written over 175 years ago in 1848. So the obvious question is, why should it still be relevant today? An article in the Guardian newspaper a few years ago said that the Communist Manifesto is currently having a moment because its ideas have a habit of popping up in times of economic and social crisis. The article points out that huge numbers of young people are turning their backs on capitalism. Now, that sentiment has been strong since at least the 2008 financial crisis, and it's grown stronger as inequality has increased, as the far right has emerged as a serious threat, and as the climate crisis has become an existential emergency. The manifesto is about why a revolution to get rid of capitalism is both necessary and possible, and it's about the basic principles of an alternative to capitalism. And that's true, even though the word capitalism actually doesn't appear in the manifesto itself. Marx and Engels use the expression bourgeois society. What the manifesto provides us is an account of where capitalism came from and how it works, and an argument for the centrality of class for understanding the world and, more importantly, for changing it. Now, when I was an undergraduate a long time ago, back in the 1970s, the most common criticism of Marxism was that it was outdated. Marx may have described 19th century capitalism accurately, but contemporary capitalism, we were told, was different. Economic crises were a thing of the past, living standards were rising for everyone, and capital and labor were partners, not enemies. That was the world of the post-war boom, which lasted from the late 1940s to the mid-1970s. Since that time, the US and world economies have experienced a series of sharp crises. Real wages in the US are lower today than they were in 1973. Inequality has increased dramatically, and we've experienced over 40 years of a one-sided class war from the top. Today, the world looks more and more like the one that Marx and Engels were describing in 1848. A point that even many opponents of Marxism acknowledge. It's because Marx and Engels lived at a time when modern capitalism was young that they were able to analyze the system in a way that captured its essential features and its core dynamic. So the manifesto charts the way in which capitalism has shattered narrow horizons and produced technological marvels, but it also describes capitalism as a system that is increasingly running out of control. Capitalism concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a small minority. It creates huge pools of poverty. It turns life into a daily grind that prevents most people from fulfilling their potential. And it experiences frequent and enormously wasteful economic crises. Capitalism encourages greed, competition, and aggression. It degrades human relations so that they are frequently based, as the manifesto notes, on little more than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. Marx and Engels argue that capitalism is a system based on a ceaseless drive to expand, in which highly destructive economic crises are unavoidable, and which has thus become fundamentally irrational. To quote the manifesto, modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. And in a world threatened by pollution, global warming, and the destruction of ecosystems as the result of uncontrolled capitalist growth, I think this image has special resonance for us today. So capitalist society has raised production to the point where everybody could be provided with a decent life, but the conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. Each successive crisis can be overcome by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises. Private ownership and the anarchy of marketplace competition are no longer compatible with large-scale economic production integrated at the social and global levels. Well, the manifesto is above all a revolutionary call to action, an explanation not only of what is wrong with society, but how it can be transformed to create an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And central to this strategy for change is its claim that in the modern working class, the proletariat, capitalism has produced its own gravediggers. Marx and Engels argue that capitalism has created a group of people with both the capacity and the interest to fight for the overthrow of the existing system and the emancipation of all humanity. The power of the working class is based on the fact that capitalism socializes the labor process, bringing workers together in large urban centers and in large-scale units and chains of production. At the same time, the pressures of economic life tend to push workers together to fight back against their exploitation. And because of their key economic position, workers have the collective power to bring production to a halt by going on strike. For long periods of time, many workers may be satisfied with their lot under capitalism, or at least willing to put up with it. But Marx and Engels understood that this state of affairs couldn't last forever. The chaotic, turbulent, unplanned development of capitalist economies eventually throws whole societies into turmoil and turns even the most modest of working class demands into a challenge to the whole system. The process is not a smooth one. The ruling class attempts to weaken the working class by exacerbating national, racial, and other differences. But such divisions can be fought and overcome as capitalism continues to intensify the class struggle. And because of their strategic economic position, workers, whether blue collar or white collar, industrial or service, have the power to become masters of the productive forces of society by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. That's another quote, of course, from the manifesto. Now, in retrospect, the manifesto has an overly optimistic conception of how quickly these processes would work themselves out. But since the mid-19th century, capitalism has repeatedly shown that it cannot avoid periodic crises and that these crises may bring the barbarism of modern warfare in their wake. At the same time, the working class has grown ever larger on a global scale, increasing its potential power to shut down the economy and to threaten the existence of the ruling class. Will there be new upsurges in struggle in the future? According to a major study issued in 2021, we are currently in a historical period of protest. The authors, and I'm going to quote from a Washington Post article about this study, looked at demonstrations between 2006 and 2020 and found that the number of protest movements around the world had more than tripled in less than 15 years. Looking closely at more than 900 protest movements or episodes across 101 countries and territories, the authors came to the conclusion that we are living through a period of history like the years around 1848, 1917, or 1968, when large numbers of people rebelled against the way things were, demanding change. But the report also notes that there are a smaller number of protests with right-wing politics, focused on denying the rights of others and scapegoating racial or national minorities. An important reminder that in times of crisis, the right can grow as well as the left, and there is no inevitable path to working class victory. At the center of the manifesto's vision is the idea of working class self-emancipation. As Engels puts it, our notion from the very beginning was that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. Working class self-activity and self-organization is both the key to successful revolution and to the new form of society such a revolution would bring about. But unlike the early utopian socialists, Marx and Engels don't offer a detailed blueprint for the future. They are not interested in painting what they call fantastic pictures of future society. Utopian dreams are unconnected with the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, and it's primarily with analyzing these material conditions that Marx and Engels concern themselves. But the analysis of these conditions does allow them to formulate in general terms the principles on which a socialist society would be based. The first and vital step is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. Democratic working class control of society is in both the economic and political realms is the defining feature of the manifesto's conception of socialism. Without real democracy, there can be no socialism. In their preface to the German edition of the manifesto of 1872, they point to the example of the Paris Commune of 1871, where the proletariat for the first time held political power for 2 whole months, as a concrete historical example of what they had in mind. In the context of workers' democracy, the new society could advance towards its ultimate goals, the elimination of private ownership of the economy and production for the market, and the final abolition of all class divisions. Marx and Engels are clear that such dramatic economic and social changes, unlike the seizure of political power, can only come about by degrees. But through such measures as nationalization of land, banks, and large-scale industry, combined with heavy taxation of the wealthy, the new society could gradually eliminate production based on market competition and replace it with workers' control of production and democratic planning designed to meet people's needs and allow them to develop as free individuals. There's one further aspect of the manifesto's vision that is important. Capitalism is an international system. For this reason, it's impossible for a single region to break free from capitalist relations of production on its own, at least not for any significant period of time. The only way in which a workers' revolution can ultimately survive is if it spreads to other countries. But precisely because the world economy is more and more characterized by universal interdependence of nations and improved means of communication that place workers of different locations in contact with one another. And that's Marx and Engels writing in 1848. So communication has certainly improved a lot more since then. The prospects for international solidarity are arguably better today than at any earlier time. The manifesto's final call for workers of the world to unite is not just an abstract moral slogan, it's an essential precondition for the transformation of society. Capitalist crisis is inevitable, but socialist revolution is not. Capitalism may yet bring about the common ruin of the contending classes mentioned at the beginning of the manifesto. If we want to see socialism and not barbarism, then the most advanced and resolute section of the working class movement has to rebuild infrastructures of resistance and dissent, organizations and structures that don't disappear when movements go into a lull, and that can push the struggle forward when it reemerges. With the climate crisis looming, time is not on our side. But if you accept the manifesto's analysis, that's what we have to do to win the change that we need.
Thank you so much, Phil. Sabrina, would you mind going next?
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Phil, for all those words. It's very nice to be here at this Haymarket event. I was actually remembering right now that last time I talked to Phil was probably when he edited one of my articles for New Politics in 2021 when I was working on this issue of the Communist Manifesto in Brazil. So it's nice to connect these kind of things and also to meet Vanessa today. I'm thinking what I would like to Phil gave such a great introduction, and also he covered a lot of the topics in terms of the relevance of the manifesto today. I think what I want to focus on is the experience of seeing people, especially youth, reach out to the Communist Manifesto nowadays, especially when living under authoritarian rule. And which is the experience that we had in Brazil in the past few years, when we actually saw a lot of young people come in and purchase the manifesto or look it up online, try to understand what's behind the anti-communist wave that came with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. And we know it's associated with the far-right movements all over the place, in the sense that even though I understand that a lot of the people who make some sort of opposition to these far-right governments or these far-right organizations that are coming along, they're popping up everywhere. So it's not just Latin America, it's in the US, it's in Europe, it's in South Asia. Even if they don't understand themselves as communists, or even they're not inclined to see themselves as communists, there's some curiosity because the anti-communist discourse is so strong. So sometimes people are trying to figure out, so is this true? What is happening here? And we've had quite a large task trying to demystify some of the things that people hear about it. So this idea of communism being associated with poverty, with authoritarian rule, or communism being associated with different types of control or not being able to own things. So this is something that we still hear a lot around here, and we know this is also present in other places, this idea that, well, if it's communism, you can't have things, and people would be worried about this kind of stuff. So having to demystify even the most basic things means that we had to go back to the text a lot. We could go back to a lot of things that Marx and Engels said, and we could think of other big figures in Marxist history, but the Communist Manifesto was always so easy because of the way that it is written, the way that it lays out explanations around class relations, and the way that Marx and Engels themselves are trying to demystify certain concepts and certain perceptions in the society that they were living in, especially because of the context of 1848. Of the uprisings in 1848, how things are popping up in different contexts, but in the same region. We need to always remind ourselves that Marx and Engels worked on the principles of communism before this. So there was already a text that was laying some of the foundations here, but the way that they wrote the manifesto was in an agitative perspective. So actually trying to draw people in, actually trying to reach the working class, respecting the working class as a revolutionary movement. This is their main point against utopian socialism. After all, is the fact that there's a subject here, and the subject is not only capable of understanding this call, but this call cannot come into fruition without the action by the subject. So this is where you have full force. This you have power coming in. So you actually contextualize communism as an issue of power and as internationalist power, as Phil just reminded us here. And I think this is really important because some of the trends that we see nowadays have to do with this chauvinistic kind of nationalism that can be used to promote white supremacy, that can be used to promote xenophobia, and also new in addition to the old forms of imperialism and colonialism that we see throughout the world. And we know this is something that they use to try to capture the working class as well, be it because the working class is feeling abandoned or it's going through a cost of living crisis, is being pushed further out into the periphery, new forms of exploitation, new forms of marginalization that we find in society. So we have societies where you still had, obviously not fully, but some level of security in your job, some level of like workers' rights that did not come as handouts from the dominant class, but because of a lot of accumulated struggle by workers in many ways, organized through social movements, organized through unions, also through political parties, and these rights being taken away. And where you had perhaps, some security through formal labor, now like informal employment is becoming the rule. We're living in a society where this digital economy is actually creating new forms of precarious labor as well. And sometimes people are not really understanding where they fit into that. What kind of proletariat you are when you're the one driving the car, but you're getting, you're making a living through the app. So we have this effort of trying to explain these changes in capitalist society today. And some people might think, well, maybe the Communist Manifesto is not that useful anymore because they were talking about, in a bourgeois society. So you have the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, but I actually completely disagree with that idea. We have new forms of exploitation, and because capitalism is getting so creative with the use of different tools to control and to exploit society, this is why it's really important to go back to the roots to understand this. There's a place in the manifesto where Marx and Engels say that like capitalism is about the past dominating the present, and communism is about the present dominating the past. So it is about us learning, whereas capitalism will create the innovation by keeping us locked in terms of exploitation, like not being allowed to dream, not being allowed to fulfill our destiny through concrete utopias. So not in a teleological sense, but in the sense that we have a task at hand here. There are things we have to do. So going back to the Communist Manifesto, using it as a pedagogical instrument is actually very powerful nowadays. We should not give in to the temptation of just saying that because they are inclined towards anti-communism, we should actually shy away from it and try to look cool in other ways, and not really embracing the fact that the best way to fight anti-communism is by explaining communism better, is by reaching out, is about politicizing around it and contextualizing in the very rich history of struggles that we have. And these struggles are struggles around national liberation movements, their racial struggles, their gender struggles. So even things that are not directly present in the Communist Manifesto because they're not part of the 1848 context here, they're very useful because we are building on top of it, and we have new authors and other people showing up. So it shows the diversity of subjects that we have here, and this is a legacy that we need to ensure in the type of workers' organizations that we have today. From the internationalist sense, it means that the climate crisis, this horizon of ecological catastrophe that we're facing, and the way Marxist theory helps us elucidate all the different points, the complexity around it. It also shows that we have this need of understanding possible contradictions that may show up in transition efforts, in the way that we are organizing to fight climate change as well. And I think this is something that is always important to highlight, because sometimes the debates around fighting climate change or creating a big transition program or like investing in jobs or even using terms around just transition for transitioning workers in an industry, sometimes we're not taking into account where these plans are still reinforcing center-periphery relations. They're still sometimes like promoting the improvement of lives, even though marginal, because it's still under capitalism, but the improvement of lives of workers in the center at the expense of workers on the periphery, workers that perhaps might be involved in extractivism, or nowadays what we're seeing as patterns around green colonialism, because green capitalism is presenting itself as the answer nowadays, so trying to reinforce the myth of the end of history. So there's nothing else that you can do. You have to retain a green capitalist perspective, and find that if we are actually going to move forward in the sense of not only defeating capitalism, but defeating the horizon of an ecological catastrophe, so ensuring that we remain on this planet, that we can build emancipatory futures in a sustainable planet, the way for us to do that is for actually to like try to connect these struggles on a very material basis. So it's not just about solidarity statements. It's not just about standing together in the sense of saying something that's happening in another place is also important. These workers are standing up for themselves. We should do the same, but also trying to find the linkages here. And I also think that in this special moment that we are right now, a very difficult moment in the world scenario, what we're learning in the past few months is that it's not even enough to just say free Palestine, or to just say we're standing together and like we are defending the rights of Palestinian people. The biggest chance that we have is when we're actually engaging with blockages against capital, showing that the capitalist interest behind colonization of Palestine, showing that workers everywhere should be digging to what's happening with their pension funds. The students right now like promoting this very powerful movement for divestment. So showing these capitalist linkages is really important, so it can actually put an end to some of these capital flows. And then we can go back to like something that's in the manifesto, which is this idea that under capitalism you work for accumulation, and under communism you work for existence. So this idea behind existence, fruition, having a good life is something that connects us all. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in this moment, even though there are like authoritarian speeches, authoritarian actions taking place right now. Going back to the essence of what we find in the Communist Manifesto shows us a pathway for strategy as well. So a strategy that's connecting the struggles on this material level, where we're finding that something that is happening in the US or in Brazil or in Palestine or in South Africa, they require action more than statements. And this action inevitably is going to point us to the roots of capitalism, and it's going to point us to where profit is being made. And then we're going to have to figure out the ways to join hands here and put an end to these flows of capital accumulation. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to do two things. I want to talk about the content of the manifesto and why it's important today. But I also want to talk specifically about this, about why we need this book. So the Haymarket edition, the first edition that we've had for a while, has been, to my mind, the absolute best English language edition of the manifesto, bar none. There's this, whatever would be second is quite a distant second. So we need the content and the ideas of the manifesto itself for all of the reasons that Phil and Sabrina have given us. But we also need our hands held a little bit, right? And our students need their hands held. People who are new to Marxist ideas And I can tell you, as someone who is a Marx scholar, I've been working on Marx, reading about Marx, thinking about Marx, morning, noon, and night for many, many years. I constantly turn to this edition to answer students' questions about what a particular word means that might just be a bit of an archaic turn of phrase, that might refer to some particular meeting that happened in some group, some country somewhere, right? I can't keep track of all of these details. No one can. And it's just such a gift to have this edition, and to have this new edition that contains Phil's insights about how to be thinking about the relevance of the manifesto today. I make no money. I just really love this, and as an educator and as a scholar, it's so useful. The manifesto is probably the most user-friendly of Marx's writings. And for that reason, I often assign it to students. I find that sometimes scholars, academics, we can shy away from the manifesto a little bit precisely because of its user-friendliness, precisely because of this perception that being the most accessible of Marx's writings, being the one that specifically is written in this extremely polemical and popular style, that somehow that is coming at the cost of an accurate and deep and nuanced presentation of Marx's theoretical insights. And I have not found this to be the case at all, whether it's in my own engagements with the manifesto in my work, or whether it is teaching the manifesto to students and using it as a tool to help them to understand how all of these disparate elements of Marx's extremely expansive theoretical system all hang together. Marx is in that German tradition of thinking about totality, and when he says totality, he means totality, right? And so to try to bring all those pieces together, this is really the place where that happens in an effective way that people can sink their teeth into. So one of the things that often surprises readers when they approach the manifesto is the sheer number of laudatory things that Marx has to say about capitalism and about the bourgeois class and about their role in history. I want to start with talking a bit about the bourgeoisie's character as a revolutionary class. This is a key element that distinguishes Marx's and Engels's theory from other kinds of socialist theory, other kinds of radical theories that may emphasize more of the negative, the immoral, the destructive elements of capitalism, all of which deserve to be emphasized, but which cannot be understood except in the context of the progressive role that capitalism plays in bringing about the possibility of communism. Capitalism is the absolute historical precondition for the full development of human capacities that Marx argues for in communist society. And so part of that has to do with the capitalism's use of science and of materialism, at least historically, right? So one key feature of bourgeois theory and of the bourgeois mode of production at its inception, as opposed to the feudal society that it opposed and replaced unevenly, right, and inconsistently, was that it did give pride of place to science and to materialism. And rationality, materialism, and a scientific worldview facilitated the major advances in production that laid the basis for the rise of the bourgeois class. When I'm explaining this to my students, I say, if you are trying to make advances in trade, you have to actually know how fast can a ship get from here to there. You need a process that is going to work the same way every time, and that requires real objective knowledge of material processes, right? So there have made these huge advances in humans' theoretical understanding of the world and humans' capacity to subordinate things in the world, right, to our ends. And they did that all within an ideology that took capitalist class society to be the highest form of human social organization. So Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto, quote, whereas past industrial classes depend on maintaining production unchanged, the bourgeoisie must constantly revolutionize production and therewith society, end quote. And it's capitalism and the need of the bourgeoisie to constantly change and revolutionize society that have in turn produced higher levels of human consciousness about our world and about society, making it possible for human beings to have a more accurate and scientific knowledge of our social existence than was possible in previous class societies. And in Marx's words, the bourgeoisie has removed what he calls the sentimental halo from relations of exploitation, and, quote, man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind, end quote. So although the interest in science remains an important part of bourgeois thought of how capitalist industries and capitalist idea production works today, it exists in a narrow and distorted form and takes a backseat to the class's historical need to compromise with those feudal forces and or to defend itself against working class challenges to its rule. The Enlightenment ideal, which held up science as a form of thought and practice in which the deepest and most fundamental questions could be answered through the work and intelligence of human beings, has given way to a conception of science as merely the art of manipulation, often divorced from a deeper inquiry into the nature of reality, or even divorced from the idea that such a deeper inquiry is even possible or desirable to engage in. But again, here too, I think it can be difficult at times looking at a world in which capitalism is clearly so ascendant, so overwhelmingly the water in which we swim. But it's important to consider the role of dialectics in allowing us to understand this reality. So of course, it's not just the bourgeoisie that plays a role in shaping our world, and it's not just bourgeois ideas that develop in response to the circumstances in which we exist. It's not a bourgeois ideology itself is not a form of consciousness that exists only among the bourgeoisie, right, or only among bourgeois theorists. And again, as Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, quote, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Not only does the ruling class hold those ideas, but throughout the history of a class society, usually most of the people in that society hold the ideas of the ruling class. They're developed and promulgated by the ruling class in large part because they do bolster the reign of that class, and because the ruling class has the best infrastructure at its disposal to disseminate those ideas. But that alone would not be enough to ensure broad assent. In a capitalist society, bourgeois consciousness finds widespread acceptance, in large part because it actually does reflect and explain, if only in a distorted and limited manner, the world in which members of that society find themselves. The power of the capitalist class is in its capacity to transform the world so that the world as a material reality instantiates those conditions which most tend toward the flourishing of that class and towards the realization of its interests as a class. And so when we talk about what it means to say that this is, so Phil, when you mentioned that Marx uses the word bourgeois, the term bourgeois society, right? You know, it's important to talk about capitalism, but I think also putting those two ideas together, because when we think about bourgeois society, this is what it means, right? That the bourgeoisie calls the shots, and they are able to produce a world that in which that conduces towards their well-being and their advancement. And so as other people in other classes are interacting with that world and existing in that world, it's not surprising that as they develop a consciousness of that world, that consciousness is often bourgeois consciousness, right? Because it's consciousness of a bourgeois society. Much about the real social relations in which human beings stand to one another under capitalism seems to confirm the ruling ideas of that society, which in turn provide an ideological bulwark for the maintenance of those social relations. And it's with this in mind that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx replies to the charges of an imagined bourgeois interlocutor, and Marx writes the following. He says, "Don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class." We're at a moment right now, as Sabrina mentioned, where we're seeing this uptick in activism. I'm a professor at the George Washington University, which is one of the universities in the US where we have a major encampment protest in solidarity with people in Palestine, and the students are calling for the US government to stop funding this genocide and calling for their universities. The students come from universities around the DC area, and they're calling for their universities to divest from corporations that profit from making and supplying weaponry and other kinds of technology that aid in the destruction of the Palestinian people. And where I find in the kinds of conversations that I've been having about that, whether with students and peers or just with friends, with my parents, Palestine is an issue that for so long has been really in the US discussion relegated to the far left in terms of the political spectrum, and not brought out into the mainstream. And the fact that you have more mainstream discussion, and in that I include even some of the discussion taking place in mainstream capitalist newspapers and journals, where they're having to even consider the possibility that maybe not everyone who opposes Palestine is a crank, right? Or is some kind of anti-Semite or what have you, is a huge shift. It's a huge shift in the political conversation. And for that too, I'm put in mind of a process that Marx and Engels describe in the manifesto. And they describe how in moments of sharp political upheaval, people's minds get changed. Right. And so now here they're talking about class conflict. We don't quite have open class conflict yet. Right. But we have this passage from the manifesto where they say that finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole, right? And again, this notion that the attempt at a scientific, materialist, empirically grounded appraisal of reality is one that is going to make a communist out of you, right? Which is one of the reasons why there is such hostility to it, right, and to these kinds of scientific materialist accountings. I want very quickly to just speak to the question of inevitability. Often this is a question people have about Marx, this idea that he thinks that it's just a foregone conclusion that communism will come, that he is a sort of fatalistic historical determinist. If there's anywhere in Marx's writings that one might look to for support for that reading of Marx, it would be the Manifesto, right? It's the place where he exhorts workers to revolution with assurances that they have a world to win, that they have only their chains to lose. It's the place where he writes that what the bourgeoisie produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And it's easy to sort of hang on this word inevitable without noticing that what he's saying is that they're equally inevitable. The victory of the proletariat is as inevitable as the fall of the capitalist class. There are movements in history, there are things underfoot, there are developments occurring that make a socialist future possible, that lay down the groundwork for it. But whether or not that is a victory that is actually won depends entirely on our activity, on our organizing, on our theoretical development, and on our ability to keep revising and working towards a scientific, clear, objective, empirical, and well-supported and understanding of reality as possible. We can't retreat from that. So I want to conclude by saying that one of the things that makes Marx's analysis so distinctive and so powerful is is precisely his identification of the revolutionary character of the bourgeoisie, because this is something they can't run away from. As much as they want to, they can't get away from it. They're a snake eating its own tail, right? They make their profits, they get their power through a proletariat, and through a revolutionary proletariat in particular. Try as they might, they can't escape the fact that the conditions of capitalism have a revolutionary character and move us towards a future where we might truly say that we have the brotherhood of humanity realized in fact and as more than just an idle ethical phrase. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Vanessa and Sabrina, both for your excellent comments and observations and so on, insights into both the manifesto and the political period that we're in. And thanks, Vanessa, for your comments about this edition. When I was working on it, I mean, I had two main audiences in mind, and one of them were students like you. I've used the manifesto in the classroom and run into some of those same obstacles for people to understand, all those historical characters who get mentioned briefly, and you have to go chasing down to figure out who they were and why they're relevant and so on. So that was one of my audiences, and then the other is young activists who are getting political and wanting to find out more about Marx. And of course, those are two overlapping groups. Students who may come across Marx in the classroom, but they are also some of the people who are out there at the protests, who are combating what for them is so apparent, the glaring injustices in the world. And I'm glad that you both talked a little bit about the Palestine protests, which of course are so important right at this moment. That's why I've got the flag there in my background, just to remind us that that's one of the most urgent things which is happening, and it has so many negative aspects to it. The vast, the destruction, the genocide which is going on in Gaza. It's easy to get completely demoralized or depressed by that situation, but the fight back against it is what can give us hope, and that's taking place internationally. And right now, it's a high point in the U.S. with these campus occupations. It actually takes me back over 35 years to the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, which I was involved with that, and it has a lot of similarities with students who we were building shanty towns back in the 1980s and making many similar demands about divestment and a radical change in U.S. foreign policy and so on. And I think that what you see is that in moments like this, people become open to, they're looking for an understanding about how the world works. And they want to understand, why is it that the U.S. government is so hypocritical in its, always talking about democracy and human rights, and yet when we look at its actual practice, it is the enemy of both of those things, or at least it brushes them aside whenever it's in its material interests to do that. So it gets them thinking about that bigger picture. And then it also connects up with the question of how do we change things. And Sabrina, I thought your comments were right on the mark there in terms of seeing the major capitalist interests which are at play, and also how we can exert pressure on that. And one of the things I think is very exciting about this current movement is that it is connecting up with the labor movement, both in the US and in other countries. The weekend before last, I was at the Labor Notes conference in Chicago, and Palestine was a big topic for meetings and discussion there. I don't think there ever been meetings about Palestine at Labor Notes in the past. But now it clearly was one of the critical issues. It's motivating, young activists in the labor movement and older ones as well. And for the first time, we've seen major unions actually make statements, not as strong as we would like, but it's a break in the right direction, which has come as a result of the activism. I think, and it's come as a result of the sheer brutality of what is going on in Gaza. Anyway, I think having the framework of the manifesto, you're not going to have the answers just by reading the manifesto about how we should organize today, or why the US is doing what it's doing, or why the global economy is working in the way that it does. But you've got a framework which gets you asking the right questions and looking in the right direction, I think. So this movement is another example of the way in which the insights of the manifesto remain relevant for us today. I'd just say one other thing to throw in there is the nature of the working class is constantly changing. I think where people are employed, how labor markets work. You have brief periods like the period I talked about in my opening comments of it during the post-war boom, when it seemed like there was stable employment and lifetime jobs and security, and that is the exception and not the rule under capitalism. It was not like that in Marx's day. In fact, there's a passage in the manifesto where they talk about how capitalist development is making work more and more precarious. So that's not a new concept, the precarity of work, and it's not it's not something that people can look forward to today. One of the reasons why there has been this radicalization in many countries over the part. We have a polarization. There's a radicalization to the right, but there's also the very important radicalization to the left, and underlying that is the fact that capitalist development is not providing a decent existence, a secure existence for huge numbers of people, and that is a real big motivator for these political movements. So I'll pause there. I don't know if either of you wants to come in with some other thoughts, but really appreciated what you said, and I think the manifesto does give us this framework that is a I think essential starting point for understanding the way that the modern world works.
Can I just jump in real quick? So I spoke to students today who started a philosophy table at the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia encampment at the GWU campus. And I spoke to one young woman who said, yes, I just brought all my philosophy books and all my books about Marx and put them on a table, and people can come and read and talk about philosophy. And she said, we need that because we need theory, right? I think one of the things that is so, one of the things that I think is so important to understand is the way that rises in these sort of like rises in struggle also produce the possibility for theory, for education, things like teach-ins, syllabi, radical syllabi that people create, the conversations that happen when people are just sharing space with one another around a shared struggle. You might have a movement that starts out with just a point of common cause and then a whole lot of disagreement and confusion around it. But that is precisely what helps produce the space for people to work towards theoretical and political clarity with one another. And I think often there's a notion that the political clarity has to come first. The movement has to come fully, spring forth from the head of Zeus with perfectly clear strategy, theory, and tactics. But oftentimes it is the creation of a movement and of a struggle that actually provides the space for that kind of education and theoretical advancement to come.
You want to add anything, Sabrina? I think we have some questions as well, if Carlos wants to throw some of those out.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, so I'm gonna save myself for the answers.
Okay, yeah, we can go through some of the audience questions. So one that I really like, like this, we're celebrating the launch of this edition of the manifesto that, as Vanessa, talked through its relevance, and the entire sort of reason for today is about the relevance of the manifesto in today's sort of political landscape. But there's a question about, like, are there any parts of the manifesto that maybe aren't relevant anymore, or that maybe we're off base? Obviously, we have the on our side, we have the ability to look back at 175 years of history, but yeah, like, is there any part of the manifesto that you look at today that maybe could use some updating, or maybe just like the conditions just don't really like make for that anymore? And then that could be up for anybody.
Can I jump in on that one? Okay, because I this is something that we hear a lot. Like Vanessa mentioned, that like there's this sentiment that pops out here and there in the manifesto. There's almost of admiration for capitalism, right? So this is why it's always very important to contextualize why they're doing this in this particular way, why they're looking at production, why they're looking, because they're looking at the movement of history. But it's very easy to misinterpret that as way too much enthusiasm, and sometimes it's read as this Prometheanism, as we are going to dominate everything. And I believe that once you put the Communist Manifesto into context of the other things that Marx and Engels were developing, like Marx in the work around capital, or like Engels, even if you're looking like into certain things around like dialectics of nature and to Turing, you do understand that they're like they understand limits. They just didn't get a chance to do this in this, political document that is the Communist Manifesto. So I always think that this is one of the places where I'm required to provide a little bit more context. So I'm not going to say that it's not relevant anymore, but sometimes like it's hard to see the way it aged when we're dealing with ecological crisis and overall destruction nowadays. So it's always very useful to bring in some context, perhaps from the volume 3 of Capital, or some things from Dialectics of Nature, that help us understand that, in historical materialism, you do grasp material conditions and limits to material conditions, and you do grasp how capitalism is very mighty, but is also destructive. So it's one of those passages that I try to contextualize. I'm actually curious to hear from Phil and Vanessa if they've had, like people just like coming out, because what I was mentioning about like the anti-communism discourse, something that anti-communists would come out and like put like messages online or try to confuse people is on the passage on the community of women, which I think is kind of funny, because the way that they're talking about the community of women is to actually dismantle what the anti-communists were trying to argue, right? That like they're trying to dismantle this argument of like critics of communism, saying that, wow, even women will be socialized, even women will become collective property. And their point in that passage is actually to come out and say, no, like women will actually not be property anymore, and they become property under the capitalist system as toil. But because it's a very like brief mention around gender, and this is something that's not really developed in the manifesto, I also find that something that tends to be taken out of context. So I wouldn't say that like things are not really relevant, at least in my opinion. I say that certain things nowadays, they require a little bit more context. That's why I think like the work of Phil and other authors and scholars are trying to piece things together, like actually say where this came from. This was part of a discussion that was relevant back then. A lot of things that happen and like in the Communist Manifesto, or like in the 18th of Brumaire, which is the other text that I worked on, they don't make sense to people if you don't are like making direct references. It's the same thing that like maybe like 10 years, 20 years, you could take a text that's like responding to a current debate today, that people don't know what the current debate is. They're not going to know why they're making reference to this in the first place. So I find that these are like two elements that I always have to contextualize for people when they're talking like what is bourgeois marriage and things like that.
Yeah, agree with that, Sabrina. It's worth remembering, Marx wrote the manifesto in a very short period of time. There'd been months of previous discussion with Engels, and Engels wrote two sort of preliminary drafts. One of them you mentioned earlier, the Principles of Communism. They're not bad, the things that Engels wrote, but they're rather, if you compare them in sort of literary quality, I mean, the manifesto just sort of lights up in comparison to those earlier writings. But Marx drew on some of that stuff. But then he had this deadline, and we have the letters coming from. He wrote this for the Communist League, which was a group of German emigres, German worker emigres in France and England, and they wanted him to write this manifesto, and Marx often procrastinated. And in January 1848, the letters are being sent out. Where is it? You haven't written it yet. Marx was in Belgium at the time, and then he produced the thing in about 2 or 3 weeks, and it went to the publisher in February of 1848, and came out round about the same time as the 1848 revolutions in Europe were breaking out. Engels says it was published on the eve of the uprising in France. I don't think he means that literally, but round about that same time, which was late February 1848. Anyway, so you can just sort of imagine Marx writing this, staying up late, and he had a way with words, and there's just some brilliant phrases in the manifesto. We've quoted a few of them. But in some places, he gets a little carried away, I think. He looks at trends and just sort of extrapolates them. My favorite example, I'll quote it, is when he writes, "National divisions and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production, and to the conditions of life corresponding thereto." Well, I wish national divisions had just sort of vanished as a result of these economic developments, and there is a tendency in that way, in that international capitalism creates some of the abilities for workers to have solidarity across national borders, but there are other tendencies at work as well, and in fact, the bourgeoisie uses nationalism in ways that you've mentioned. As a crucial tool in trying to discipline and control the working class, because if you see national interests as your primary, as a central part of your identity, then you're going to identify with your own rulers rather than with other workers in other countries. So there's this fight which goes on between internationalism and nationalism, and Marx kind of flattens that in that passage where he only talks about the trend towards against national divisions, and we know now it's much harder to overcome those. There's also a passage at the end of the first section in which he's talking about the divisions that the ruling class uses. Nationality is one of them. And he's pretty, well, maybe dismissive isn't quite the right word, but he gives you the idea that those divisions are easier to overcome than in practice they often are, just because the class struggle will sort of push past those divisions. And I think one of the things we've learned, or that we know more clearly now, is those divisions can run pretty deep, and you have to take them on explicitly. You can't just allow class interests and the fight for economic demands and so on, you can't imagine that those things will just sort of override divisions of race and gender and nationality and so on. And particularly that is the case when the rulers of our society use those divisions very effectively to keep people separated. So you have to take that on as a central part of building unity. In other words, you can't be a reductionist about class. You can't think that because class is the underlying division in society, that it will simply override these other divisions. They have to be fought. They have to be analyzed. We have to have movements which take on those issues as well. So I think there's several places like that where it's not that Marx says something which you just have to sort of cross out, but you have to qualify it, or you have to elaborate and develop these ideas. And of course, this is an early work as well. This was written in 1848, so Marx was writing for another 35 years after this. And there's plenty in Marx and Engels' later writings, I think, which take on some of these issues as well. But as you'd expect from this early overview, not everything is exactly right. But it's so exciting to read it. At least once you understand the historical references and can get past some of the archaic language, it does give you a very exciting. It's not a dry historical analysis. It's a kind of riveting. There's a drum beat going on as it moves towards its crescendo. So those are some of my thoughts about some of the places where we would want to revise and update the manifesto.
I'm happy to speak to this as well. So I think so chapter 3 on socialist and communist literature, I don't think it's necessarily outdated, but I don't find myself having a lot of debates with French legitimists in my everyday, right? And so that is a chapter where we really have to do the work to unpack what is it that Marx was critiquing in the positions of these various political groups, and are there ways that either groups that exist today represent those same politics, or ways that the kinds of critiques that Marx is raising are ones that we can learn from in evaluating various kinds of political theory and strategy today. So it's not something that you're going to be able to sort of just apply directly. And I think more broadly, Marx is a lover of irony. I mean, the man loves an ironic turn of phrase. And if you're already in the swing, you're kind of speaking his language, then it becomes very beautiful, very funny, very engaging. But when you're brand new to it and everything he's saying sounds a little out there, then it's hard, I think, for new readers sometimes to distinguish between the wild thing he's saying that he believes and the wild thing he's saying that you're supposed to know is obviously wild and bananas and a thing he would never think, right? And so that just takes some time. It takes a tool like this one that is giving you some guideposts to help you understand the arguments that he's making. But I think his love of irony is both, and I'm influenced in this by a book by a Brazilian Marxist literary theorist, Ludovico Silva, and his book Marx's Literary Theory. So I'm influenced in this opinion by, I think, the very good arguments made in that book. But Marx's irony is both a stylistic flourish and an attempt to show that things are their opposites in good dialectical fashion, right? Something appears one way on the surface, but you investigate that concept, you investigate that reality a bit further, and you find that actually it is its own opposite, it contains its own negation. I think, so I saw there's a question about Marx on the family, and he takes the imagined bourgeois interlocutor who is charging the communists with abolishing the family, and Marx responds, "You already abolished it. It's already gone. The family, you know." And Marx, we know, was a family man, loved his kids, you know, loved to be home with the wife, you know, the kids and all that. You know, he has no particular antipathy towards family life, quite the opposite. But his aim there is to show that as a social reality, working class people already have no time to spend at home. They have no time to spend on those types of personal relations, and that therefore this is already negated within capitalist society. And what communism has to offer is what I might, in a Hegelian turn of phrase, call the negation of that negation, which would be the actual ability of human beings to have those kinds of social, loving, comforting, and free relationships with one another that tend towards their mutual flourishing.
Thank you so much for that. So we probably have time for maybe one more question, and then maybe if the panel wants to do like a quick round of a couple minutes each for some final thoughts. But yeah, I think, you know, I think as Sabrina mentioned, like kind of looking at some of like the later works of Marx, like Capital, that kind of laid the foundation for a lot of sort of arguments around ecosocialism and the disruption of nature and nature and humanity. I think, you know, talked about some of the way, like Phil talked about some of the way in which some of the later works kind of added more context. There's another question about, you know, like left scholars talk about racial slavery and racism to be sort of like a central component of capitalist exploitation, of oppression, yet Marx doesn't really take on the question of race in the Communist Manifesto as such. And if we on the left think that that's a problem, what is one way that we can go about solving that? Maybe like looking at some others. And I think that's also another one thing that I'll chime in and say as well, that and folks can say more about it. But you know, like socialism, Marxism, that didn't end with Marx. Just as later works of Marx expanded on these, there's many scholars from all over the world that have also taken on these questions and have expanded on it and adjusted them to the world around us. So just to say that. But yeah, I'll throw that question out there about sort of the question of racial capitalism, slavery, race, and capitalist oppression. And whoever wants to take that on.
Well, I mean, Marx writes much more about this in Capital than in, you know, the Communist Manifesto. I mean, the Communist Manifesto does have a fairly narrow vision in its historical account. It's talking about what happened internally in Europe, leading to the bourgeois revolutions. And no, he doesn't talk about how essential slavery and pillaging of the the colonial world was an essential part of the development of early capitalism. He does address that in Capital itself, and Capital is a much more difficult book to read. But the final part 8, the final part of it is about the history of capitalism, and it goes into this in much greater detail. So that's what I would recommend. You know, if you want to read what other things that Marx has to write about race and capitalism and the role of slavery and pillage of the new world, that is addressed in that section. And yes, Carlos, many people have taken this much further. So I don't think it contradicts what he's written, what he writes in the manifesto. But it's a missing piece, if you like, that he has more to say about later.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I would echo Phil's observation that the Communist Manifesto is a document that simultaneously gives us a lot of insight into Marx's theoretical framework, but is at the same time a political document written at a particular historical moment toward a particular end. So I find that that Marx generally had much more to say, actually, about slavery and especially about the transatlantic slave trade than he's generally supposed by many to have said. So, there's the famous line, labor in white skin cannot emancipate itself where the black skin is branded. We have Marx, who one of his side hustles was writing articles for U.S. newspapers, and he wrote an open letter to Abraham Lincoln, an open letters to the to white American workers, specifically about the Civil War. And the importance of the emancipation of slaves in the U.S. I think that there is a long and sordid history, at least in the U.S. context in particular, of driving a wedge between socialist activism and socialist organizing and anti-racist activism and anti-racist organizing. And I guess if I were a member of the ruling class trying to keep my hands on the reins of society, I would drive that wedge pretty deep too, because that is a combination that is of working class activism and Black liberation struggle that historically has driven some of the most important and radical movements in U.S. history. Now, and I also will echo Phil's comment that it's extremely important to not end our discussion of Marxist theory with Marx. Oftentimes, the idea that Marxist theory has little to say about race proceeds by actually perpetrating the very same erasure that it claims to call out, namely by just not reading Black Marxists. And so reading people like Claudia Jones, Angela Davis, W.B. Du Bois, Claude Lightfoot, his Racism and Human Survival, I think is quite good. There's all kinds of work written from different perspectives. I don't agree with everything that any of the figures I just named has to say, but I think that that's exactly the work of activists and scholars to bring those ideas out into the forefront, so that the necessary interconnections between these struggles can be brought to the fore and can be better understood.
If I could add a couple of things on that, I think we always have to warn ourselves against the tendency of wanting an author or a big reference of ours to exhaust everything, to cover all of the topics. We need to understand that Marx was very prolific, actually. Like, he would try to dabble into geology, natural sciences, and go back to a bunch of authors reading in different languages. And he was probably more productive than most of us in our lifetime, considering also all of his family difficulties, political difficulties, his illnesses and things like that. But he was also at the same time trying to found a methodology, a particular way of looking to reality. So that was already a very big job. So he tried to reach into a lot of things. And when we're looking to his letters, these other articles that he used to write, like Vanessa mentioned, his drafts and manuscripts and notes everywhere. He did mention a lot of things, but I think it would be kind of unfair to ask for him and Engels together to absolutely put everything together and to sew everything together. when in fact, one of the calls behind communist thinking is for collective work, is for getting debate flowing, getting more people to join hands and bringing more data as well. The Marxist method is profoundly empirical. So he was dealing with a particular context. He was also responding to some of the debates at the time. So the polemics that were more famous at the time, this necessity, like we have nowadays, to perhaps like respond to like a really bad pundit. And sometimes it's even like a waste of our time. We could like devoting our time to like better data and how to explain things, but we still have to answer the pundit every now and then. We know that in fact, like during writing Capital Volume 1, because Marx was so dedicated to the critique of political economy that sometimes Engels got the job of having to reply to the pundit. So they were trying to do a lot of different things at the same time, and I think there's a difference between having a fundamentally wrong analysis and having an incomplete analysis of things. So obviously there's like incomplete analysis, and this is our job. It's a job of people who came before us, what we're doing now, people who are still going to come after us, trying to complement this. And we know that some of these debates are still very lively, like the debates around labor theory of value, the debates around like how we're dealing with the essence of what is labor, what is the workforce, now that we're in this age of artificial intelligence, now that we're in this age of multiple types of exploitation, what this means in terms of the renewal of imperialist dynamics. So it is very lively, and it is our job to say that if something was not covered, we need to look into why it was not covered, but do our jobs in trying to cover it, precisely because there is a tendency a lot in political circles of expecting too much for everyone, so we can just kind of put people into a pedestal. And I think that like one of the things that we always try to emphasize is that with the Communist Manifesto, we have one of these incredible foundational texts. It tells a lot about reality, and it does not tell about other elements of reality, but we look into it and then we'll build from it into other kind of things, because what we're doing here is not religion. And even in religion, you're going to have debates about theology. So if we're not doing religion here, then we're going to have even more debates, even more hard work to try to complement, bringing new things. There are challenges that we face today. There are new, and they're going to require us to be creative and to like question ourselves as we're doing that.
Thank you all so much. So before we wrap up, we'll do one last quick kind of go around with some final thoughts. We'll go in reverse order from where we started. So we'll have Vanessa, followed by Sabrina, and then Phil. We'll let you have the last word. But before I kick it off to Vanessa, I just wanted to give one last plug for this edition of the Communist Manifesto, available at haymarketbooks.org. Yeah, thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, I'll let you go ahead, Vanessa.
So I wanted to recommend the book Marx at the Margins by Kevin Anderson. It is, to my awareness, certainly the most exhaustive look at Marx's writings on areas outside of Europe, right? And his ideas about race, colonialism, ethnicity, and so on. I don't want to sort of like launder Marx either. I mean, Marx at various times, like you can find in his letters him vocally opposing slavery, and you can also find him using racist phrases in some of his letters. And so I want to be honest about that as well. But I think it really does go to that question that Sabrina raised of, is the thing that we have here a faulty theory, a bad theory, or is it an incomplete theory that requires further elucidation? But specifically the question of what did Marx say about race, that's one text that folks might find useful. And And other than that, I just want to thank my co-panelists. I thought this was a wonderful discussion, and I just want to make a last plug for grabbing a copy of this second edition of the manifesto. I know that it feels like things are kind of coming full circle a bit in terms of students wanting the electronic versions versus really wanting like paper, wanting something that they can sit together with, that they can physically bring to a protest. They want these things. And so we're just really fortunate to have them. Thank you.